All right, so people can keep dropping in. I do want to get started since it's the end of the day. We don't want to get into anyone's family time too much, but my name's Ariana Rashke. I'm the program director for the Central Arizona Conservation Alliance. I am standing in for Anya Quiroz tonight, who you guys know from our other speaker series. Helping me tonight is Jenny Davis as well. She's our Eco Flora coordinator. And I would love to introduce Ben Wilder, our speaker for tonight. He's the director of the Desert Laboratory at Tumamoc Hill since October 2016, and also the interim director at CASMEX, the Consortium for Arizona-Mexico Arid Environments. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about fast evolving fire connectivity and risk in the Sonoran Desert. And he's going to be talking about the 2020 Bighorn Fire in the Santa Catalina Mountains as a case study to better understand the changing nature of fire in the semi-arid North America. So greetings, Ben. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited for this, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Ariana. Appreciate the invitation. Are you all able to see the screen share that I'm doing? Okay, wonderful. So thanks for joining tonight or watching this recording. I appreciate being able to talk with you all on this subject of essentially desert fires and the increased frequency we're seeing of desert fires. And I really appreciate you all putting this series together in this Wildfire Awareness Month here in May of 2021. So, you know, a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about really came forth as questions, and there's still a lot of questions, but we have some answers now, as we were experiencing essentially a year ago, and that really intense fire season of 2020, and seeing kind of the increased extent of wildfires in desert lowlands. So, you know, I'll just say that this isn't a very rosy topic. There's a lot of change happening, and I think that's going to be one of the major themes that I'm going to be talking about and trying to help contextualize or understand that change, and then to just kind of what does that mean. So anyway, like I said, some of this is a little stressful and kind of intense, so feel free to have a glass of wine or a beer with you while we watch this presentation, but it's not all negative, right? I think it's really important that we keep in mind and understanding the change to be able to prepare and adapt to it. So these are images like this is unfortunately what I think many of us were seeing either with our own eyes or on the news if you were living in Tucson or exterior Phoenix or even other communities, and of course other parts of the Western US at different parts of the summer last year. And unfortunately, given the extreme drought that's kind of persisting throughout much of the West and the Southwest, perhaps similar images to what we may be seeing in the coming months as well. So this is the Catalina foothills just on the northern edge of Tucson at the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains as the Bighorn Fire was kind of moving downstream. This is an image in closer outside of Phoenix to the east of the bushfire and then in the Tonto National Forest. And again, these scenes of you know, saguaros backlit by fire. Thankfully, we're not very used to seeing them, but unfortunately, that definitely was the case last year, and maybe more so into the future. So I just kind of want to set a little bit of context of some of the events that happened last year that caught my attention, certainly, and I think many of ours. So one I just mentioned was the bushfire. This is in the middle of June, just outside to the, again, to the kind of a little bit to the northeast of metropolitan Phoenix. About close to 200,000 acres burned in this fire. And you can see in this image, it's actually started, we believe started off this freeway, and some of you in the audience may actually know much more about this fire than I do. But the best I can tell, it started in the desert lowlands and then worked upslope. And I'll be talking about those dynamics later, and then moved up into the kind of sky islands or the mountain regions. Another fire, again, not in our deserts, but just in California, in the kind of Mojave Desert, was the dome fire. Some of you, I'm sure, may have heard of this. This was core habitat for the Joshua tree, or Yucca brevifolia, and covered maybe a little bit less of extent, close to 45,000 acres. This was a bit later in the summer in August, and but unfortunately went through one of the core habitat zones for Joshua tree, killing many thousands, and putting a lot of questions into how they cope with fire, very similar to our situation with saguaro. So a lot of question was, okay, what's driving these fires? What are the fuels? What's the role of the invasive species in these fires? What's the role of natives? What's the role of climate? How are species responding? Native species, invasive species. What is the projection for these fires? These are all the kind of questions that are lingering for us. And as you saw on my title slide, this is the area, you saw a lot of names. This is a collaboration that I've been very fortunate to work with a number of people and to try to answer those questions. So I'm just I'll get at various pieces of these throughout the talk, but the first one here is, okay, what were the fuels? What was driving this? So this is an image of from March, early March, a year ago, 2020. And the green here, so just the Phoenix, metropolitan Phoenix is about here, Tucson in this area. And the green is a vegetation index, NDVI, taken from satellite images. And essentially this is where plants are growing. And what you see here is much of the mountain ranges throughout the region are very green, with denser color of green. But you also see the lowlands here, very extensive green patches. And that's because we had quite strong winter or spring rains in 2020 that produced a lot of annual biomass, both native and non-native. So when we got to June, middle of June of last year, much of that biomass had dried out. So this is that same satellite area, Phoenix, Tucson, and all of that green is gone, but that biomass is still on the ground, is just now dry. And it's very similar to what we're currently experiencing. Last June was a very windy period. I don't have data as part of this presentation, but springs are getting windier in the Sonoran Desert, and we believe that's connected to climate change. And so it was a very hot, dry, windy, arid forest summer, which is what the months of May and June, essentially the period after the rains and before the summer monsoons, just that baking of the land, the arid forest summer. So it's really drying out that vegetation. And on 18th of June, we had in parallel, the Bighorn fire here in the Catalina Mountains outside Tucson, and then the bush fire outside of Phoenix, raging through our kind of desert lowlands, grasslands, and mountain ecosystems. Now, just to kind of contextualize this and these fire events, this is not a local thing. This is increased fire activity, and scope, scale, and frequency is happening at a continental scale. This is from early September. You can think back to the very extreme fire season that happened last year along the West Coast, especially through California and then into Oregon and Washington. This is one of the most dramatic days of a set of several weeks of horrific fires throughout that period. And then also at the global scale, this is an image of Eastern Australia and the fires that they experienced at the end of 2019 going into the very beginnings of 2020, and the massive fires that were happening through Australia. So again, the mechanisms are a bit different, but I just think it's important that we can think about the change that's happening at the global scale, the change that we're seeing in our backyard or the areas adjacent to us, but understanding that the fire is playing a huge role at change at the global level. And I just think it's very important to keep these things kind of, at least conceptually, linked in our heads. The rest of the talk, I'm going to be focusing on mechanisms and details about the Sonoran Desert and really, again, using the bighorn fires, a case study. So zooming way in from talking about the global scale, way into kind of the Sky Islands around Tucson and southern Arizona. But I guess I want to have us thinking big as well. So one of the ways to kind of think big, and again about potential climate and driving mechanism, is the INSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index. So I won't get too deep here, but essentially this is what drives the El Nino or La Nina cycles. And what we're really talking about is sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, all the way from the Western Pacific in Australia, or the Eastern Pacific, or off the California coast, essentially off of North America. And you have essentially differential sea surface temperatures across that gradient. And we know that when for our part of the Pacific Ocean, or off of North America, when sea surface temperatures are warm, that leads to what we refer to as an El Nino cycle, which for the Southwest generally means above average precipitation, wetter years. And then when the sea surface temperatures are cold, that is a La Nina condition, and that correlates with drier conditions, or especially in the winters and springs. So this is the kind of the, don't worry too much about the numbers. Essentially what you're showing is an index of that variability between warm sea surface temperatures or colder, and again, as an average. And so anything above in positive values in red is warmer temperatures, El Nino, think wet, and blue is colder sea surface temperatures, dry, less rain. And this is up to current. And so you see currently the La Nina that we are in, which is driving the continuation of the drought that we're experiencing, and the kind of the absence of winter rains largely through our region. But these spikes, these El Nino years, especially, even if they're fairly moderate on this scale, they strongly correspond to fairly large wildfire years in the Sonoran Desert, especially 2005, and especially 2020. So that is really driven because of the image I was showing you, the NDVI. There's a lot of biomass produced. And with biomass, you create fuels. So there's a large background climatic mechanism here of El Nino and La Ninas. And how El Nino and the INSO is changing with warming sea surface temperatures or warming temperatures globally is an area of active study. But this is a very strong trend, we know. And so essentially, El Nino years are very strongly linked to wildfire years in the desert. And let me just actually go one step deeper into that. And the reason is because normally there is not enough fuel in the desert to carry a fire. So if you're familiar with the Arizona uplands or your Saguaro Palo Verde communities, you generally don't have a lot of matrix or fine fuels that can promote or carry a fire. So often you can think of the pour gasoline on a Palo Verde, and light it, the Palo Verde would burn, but the fire wouldn't go elsewhere. Two things change that situation. One is winter rains that create a promotion of annual plants or other semi-perennial grass species. And then invasive species also are very much promoting linking that fuel systems. And I'll be talking about both coming up. This is data here from Schmidt and Rogers. This is actually a fairly old data set that only goes between the 50s and up to honestly my birth year in about 1984. But the trends they found, and we haven't continued this data set out, but the trends they found already 30 plus years old are very important to what we're seeing now. And so what you have here is on the x-axis, so it's going forward in time in that period of time I was mentioning. And then you have the number of fires that's been increasing over time and the number of hectares has been increasing over time. And again, you see this modulation of the kind of peaks of high years of number of hectares burned and then low peaks. And again, that also is correlating with that ENSO cycle. Interestingly, in addition to that, is you're seeing when during the year are the majority of these fires. And you see both from the hectares burned and the number of fires, they correspond very much to that arid forest summer I was talking about, to that drying of the biomass that may have come up in the spring season. So one of the things that's happening both along that time, and let's just, I don't have the data and to share with you, but if we were to continue that plot from 83 to 2020, I'm almost certain the curve would just continue to go up and this data would just be strengthened, the trends that they're finding. And that's because you're getting more people, more ignition points, and then also more invasive species that are creating that fuel load. This is an image that's showing a similar trend, but we've zoomed out now to the entire Western United States. And we're looking through essentially number of acres burned over time. Again, this data stops in 2010. And the mechanisms here are a bit different because we're talking about the entire West and forest generally. But fire suppression is a massive driver of this. But again, zooming out and thinking larger, that the scale of fires across Western US are expanding in almost an exponential way, as you can see in this image. So I kind of want to talk a little bit conceptually about what's happening, what the fire dynamics are kind of currently and in the past a bit on our elevational gradients. So this is a kind of a schematic that shows could be the Catalina Mountains or perhaps the Sky Islands outside of Phoenix, or also some of the other Sky Islands in our region. Sky Island being a mountain range that host a pine forest or conifers at its top, but surrounded by kind of an ocean of desert at its lower elevations. And you have this kind of classical zonation of biomes, from the desert scrub to semi-desert grassland, oak woodland chaparral, pine oak woodland, and then of course your conifer forest at the top. And you generally currently have fires that are fairly contained from that desert grassland, the lower elevation, up to the conifer forest, the higher elevation. And that's where fires are in our region. Very infrequently would you get fires down in the deserts, and those were confined to these El Nino years. That's the condition previously. I just want to draw into attention here that the wildland urban interface, that's both here kind of at the desert grassland boundary, both in kind of more rural areas, but also in urbanized areas, is a really important point to focus here about these communities and their impact and interface with wildfires. So in Tucson, and I believe in certain parts of Phoenix and other communities throughout the West, think about Las Vegas or others, a really key place for cities to develop and expand, and often more affluent areas of these cities, is that higher elevation point, just kind of right as the mountains start to grade up, right? You have incredible view sheds. You have a really desirable place to live. And that is the kind of the wildland urban interface I'm going to be focusing into as part of this talk. And you saw in my image of the bighorn fire in the Catalina Mountains, that fire creeping right down into that wildland urban interface. What we're seeing, and this is the near future, this is the trend we're projecting, is that boundary, that barrier between the grassland and the desert, which was previously kind of a fire barrier, is being eviscerated. And you're having fires that can either start up in the forest and work themselves downslope into the desert, or vice versa, such as the bushfire, starting at lower elevations and working themselves upslope into the forest. And the mechanism there is grassification, which means the increasing of perennial, non-native invasive grass species, and also annuals that are creating that biomass linkage that is allowing a fuels connectivity between the deserts and the grasslands, which is a novel situation. So and right in the middle of that linkage is the wildland urban interface, where you have the clustering of the resources of many of our kind of western desert cities. Talking a little bit about invasive species here, one of the main principal drivers of this change in the Sonoran Desert is bufflegrass, which is a perennial bunch grass that's native to sub-Saharan Africa that was introduced for cattle forage and erosion control all the way back into the 1930s and 40s, but sat latent on the landscape until about the 1990s, at which point, and this is still kind of a frontier of invasive species ecology, it reached a threshold and then was able to kind of expand itself into multiple unrealized niches in the Sonoran Desert, meaning bare ground areas or outcompete other species, and really it's expanded itself into dense monocultures or paddocks. This species is also quite invasive in parts of Central Australia, in parts of Hawaii, and very much so in the Sonoran Desert located in Mexico and Sonora, where it is still actively planted for cattle forage and kind of actively planted and managed there. It produces abundant biomass. It's this woody grass. It evolved in a grassland ecosystem, which is critical, meaning fire is part of its evolutionary history. It wants to burn. And it comes back stronger with burning. It doesn't, and also if you just were to trim back or browse or kind of graze the stems without pulling the roots out, the plant also responds vigorously to that. And so it is a remarkably arid adapted species and has transformed and it consumed hundreds of thousands of acres throughout the Sonoran Desert and is continuing to actively expand. And I imagine many of you on the call are familiar with the species. It is pretty easy to identify once you get the look of it. That kind of bottle brush inflorescence grows in large clumps. And unfortunately, once you get the look of it, you may start seeing it everywhere. So this is an image from where I work. This is the Tumamoc Hill, where the Desert Laboratory is located here in Tucson. And we have a really intense paddock and stand of bufflegrass. And this image, more than anything, is to show the kind of that continuous monocultural or dense stand of bufflegrass. You really get the sense of how it can create that fuel matrix there. An encouraging note, this image does not quite look the same today. We have support from the Arizona Fireland Program, Forestry and Fire Department, that is providing support, financial support to the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum and the university to control and get rid of bufflegrass on this slope. So much of this population has already been controlled, and we're hoping for a wet summer to continue that effort. Bufflegrass is not the only species of concern here. Fountain grass, also in the same genus, and Sancris, or in the grass family, Poaceae. And then also annual species are a major concern here. Red brome is from the Mediterranean region, and then one that's a concern and a growing concern in the sunflower family is stink net, which is increasingly a problem in the metropolitan Phoenix area, and hopefully we're recognizing it in time around Tucson. But the species aggressively grows, and then when it dries out, it becomes a major fuel source. Again, zooming out here, this is a paper published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences in 2019 by Fusco and al. And it talks about the driving role of invasive species in increasing fire intensity and scale throughout the Western United States. And every region of much of the United States, but especially the West, has its own invasive species that of concern that's really allowing the driving of these fire regimes. And of course, it's multiplicative with multiple species. So Bromus tectorum, sheetgrass is a major one. Again, Bromus rubens here. which is the red brome, the annual grass that especially is intense in the California deserts, and then of course Penicillium ciliare buffgrass in our region, among others. So now I want to zoom in here and talk a bit about the bighorn fire and try to kind of address some of the things we learned. So the major question we had was, okay, what was driving the fire? Were invasive species responsible for much or any or part of the fire progression? So in June 7th, there was a dry lightning strike that started the fire kind of on the far western edge of the Catalina Mountains. And then it just kind of started to work its way throughout the vast majority of the Catalina mountain range. And it really kind of started that grassland ecotone level and then worked itself up into higher elevations. And by the end, it had burned about 120,000 acres, with some days being very dramatic. This is just some imagery just to kind of give you a little bit of visual of what the Catalina Mountains look like and how extreme they are and topographically diverse. So much of this was flown in August of last year, and you can see the much of that burned out area throughout the mountains. So this is an image here that shows the vegetation zones within the bighorn fire perimeter. So the black is the bighorn fire perimeter, and that kind of red is your Sonoran Desert scrub. Your kind of brown here is the desert grassland, and then you're grading into the majority of the Catalina Mountains, as you'd expect, are these kind of higher elevation oak woodlands or ponderosa woodlands. And that is in fact the majority of what burned. Where I'm going to be really focusing our attention, because we're talking about desert fires here, not so much forest fires, is that that kind of boundary of the bighorn fire, where it ended. So there's a couple of things I want to point out in this image. I hope you're able to see my cursor, but I can also identify by color. So again, black is the boundary of the bighorn fire. The yellow lines here are airdrops or slurry bombs that were dropped. Very importantly here is the white line, which is the 1,200 meter elevation zone, which essentially is 4,000 feet, which is very consistently the boundary between the desert grassland above and the desert, Sonoran Desert or desert scrub below. Also, you have here, and then the blues and greens are just the same vegetation patterns from the previous image: oak woodlands, grasslands, and other woodlands above. The turquoise here in this image are the extent of bufflegrass. So we have a pretty extensive map, geospatial map of bufflegrass infestation on the Catalina foothills done by Aaron Olson. And you can already start seeing some results from this image. Essentially, there are, in some cases, you do have bufflegrass that is coalesced above that 1,200 meter zone. But when you look at the Catalina foothills, much of that bufflegrass is below that 1,200 meters and also is below where the bighorn fire stopped. So ultimately, what happened with the bighorn fire in its lower elevations was it started up high. It did not start down low, right? It started in the grasslands and then worked its way downhill at night. And as it did go through that grassland flammable habitat, it hit that 1,200 meter zone, was low intensity. And as it started to drop down into the desert, it didn't have the field load. It didn't have those extensive stands of bufflegrass because those extensive stands of bufflegrass have not coalesced at the higher elevation, and essentially burned itself out before it reached these massive stands of bufflegrass below, which is kind of the worst case scenario of which I personally thought that this was the direction of what it was going. Ultimately, the bighorn fire was a near miss for that wildland urban interface and much of the desert vegetation below. This is kind of on the ground, what it looks like. This, I'll just show you back up that image I'm switching to next is pretty much exactly right here. So just at that 1,200 meter zone, the desert grassland interface on a south facing slope. So you get saguaros that occur a little bit higher elevation than others because you don't have as much freezing or cold events. And you can see the essentially a little bit of burn here, a modest fuel break, and then desert vegetation unburned just on the side. This is just another image that's showing, again, the bighorn fire perimeter here in red, and then where the buffalo grass extents are below. And because it was working itself down, it largely did not get into that buffalo grass. Here's just another image to kind of illustrate what I'm showing you. So this is the zonation, elevation zonation of where all that mapped buffalo grass, all those turquoise polygons are. And this is the amount of area invaded. And you can see the majority of that infestation is about 1,000 meters, or essentially 3,000, 2,800 feet, a good bit below that 1,200 meter line. We believe this is a snapshot in time and not necessarily how it is going to be, rather that there is a continued unchecked expansion of buffalo grass populations that we already know has been the case and has been documented over the last 10 years. And while we don't necessarily know if this peak will equal the lower peak, or if there will always be kind of a higher infestation at lower elevations, what we do know is that colder temperatures are becoming less frequent, which is a limiting factor to buffalo grass and other desert species. And so we expect that this area to be infested, essentially that gap that saved much of the desert and desert homes from the bighorn fire to kind of infill and unfortunately create that linkage that I'm talking about between the desert and the grasslands above. So how did different species respond to the fire? Of course, we're very interested in saguaros, one of the iconic species of the Western United States in general. And so we set up some plots, actually in a fire called the Mercer Fire, which is a more localized lightning struck fire from 2019 that occurred in a buffalo grass stand, also in the Front Range of the Catalina Mountains. And what you see here on this image is a couple things. So you have the severity of fire burned on saguaro height here on the x-axis, and then the fire, how much of a saguaro was burned on the y-axis. And your smaller ones were very much almost entirely burned. And you can see that when we know for certain that they're dead, it's marked with a triangle, but also the darker the color of the circle here is the more likelihood that saguaro is predicted to die. And so you're essentially what you're seeing here is that your smaller to again, younger saguaros are getting more of their area burned and thus have much higher predicted mortality. This is kind of saying the exact same thing, but in a bit of a different way. So you have your percent of your fire burned on your x-axis and predicted mortality here. And so we have essentially, if you have right around that 75% burn area, or even a little less, the likelihood of saguaro surviving that event diminishes rapidly. And this is based on data from Todd Eskew and others from a study they did, extrapolated to the Mercer Fire burn scar of saguaros. So this is an ongoing area of study. So that's a permanent plot we have in the Mercer Fire. We're gonna go back and continue to track the fate of these individuals. I think one of the interesting things here, though, is that just because a saguaro does catch on fire, doesn't mean it's necessarily going to die in the next year or two, especially if it may be an older individual. But we do know that especially young individuals or anything burned more than about 50% or more has a very strong trajectory towards death. Okay, continuing on these questions of, okay, what was the driving biomass for these fires? How did the species respond? We set up a whole number of plots, of permanent plots, in Catalina State Park, which is a state park here, just on the north, kind of west corner of the Catalina Mountains, on a north-facing slope down there, so not on the Front Range, but a little bit over. And we put them in two different habitats, both in the grassland ecosystem that burned and in the desert down below. And we had paired plots of same size in 15 by 15 meters, 10 replicates each, in burn zones and then unburned neighboring adjacent areas. So the first we wanted to understand was what was the species richness, how in this point zero, immediately after the fire, these plots were done in September. What was how many species did you see in the burned areas as compared to the unburned, both in the grassland and there's an upland? And as you would expect, we're seeing much fewer species diversity in the burned plots. This may change over time. And keep in mind that we had the monsoon of 2020, hopefully not to be repeated, that didn't allow a lot of as much regrowth as you would have if it had rain. So we'll see how these numbers change over time. And it's very possible that these burn plots could increase fairly rapidly as fire colonizers or other species come in. Now, this next plot is kind of trying to get at the cover, or so what was driving the fire in these plots. And you can see that there's 3 different colors in the bars here. Black is corresponding to essentially material that was burned and is dead. White is alive, and gray is a regrowth or resprouting species. So in the grassland, the majority of that cover in the control area was your annual forbs and grasses. But this was not just invasive species, actually predominantly was native species. And when we did on the ground hikes through much of the kind of grassland desert ecotone throughout the Bighorn Fire perimeter, that is exactly what we saw. In some areas you had red brome, some areas you had lemon lovegrass, but in a lot of areas you had aristidas, bouteloas, multiple your annual and perennial aristidas, threons, and many other species that were not just your non-native species. So again, that promotion of growth driven by the El Nino rains of the springs of 2020 produced all this biomass. You then had in the burned areas, you completely burned out all that fuel, right? That was in the grasses, but you also lost a lot of your shrubs. In the desert scrub, it's a different story. There were very little coverage of annual grasses down there. And it was really kind of your other shrubs that were carrying the fire. And of course, the increased extensive burn of the Palo Verde or Parkinsonia microphylla. Now, this is another way to look at kind of the impact on species. I'm getting a little deep into the data here, but it was a very interesting result. So those 3 colors, black is burned, white is alive, and gray is regrowth. And you'll see this is showing data from the desert grassland. And you have these are scientific names. I'll try to decode some of this for you. But keep in mind here the numbers. So this is essentially, and it's ranked by the percentage of species that had regrowth. So one of our questions was, how resilient are these desert species to being burned? And surprisingly, some of them are very resilient, meaning they're resprouting or they're coming back after the fire. If you focus here, an ambrosia or ragweed, many of its individuals have come back. Mallow has come back. The Crameria or rain dratneys, most of them are coming back. Almost every single, over 1,000 fairy dusters or caliandras in the plot all regrew. Genusia, some of you may be familiar with, the yellow flowered Malpighiaceae and the vine that occurs in the summer rainy season. The vast majority of it was regrowing. And this was, again, all without summer rain. Interestingly, as you'd expect, many of the succulents, barrel cactus, pincushion, prickly pears, choyas, fared very poorly. Similar data from the desert plots, where you had, again, the fairy dusters. And very interesting, I'll draw your attention to Parkinsonia microphylla or little leaf Palo Verde. While many of them did die, a good number were actually resprouting, which was a surprise. This is also seen in the blue Palo Verde, Parkinsonia florida, as well. Smaller sample size, but definitely a good amount of burning. And we're going to be redoing this data, this plot data, after the summer rains of this year, and see how these trends hold up. So I'll just mention here that this resprouting capacity of many desert species surprised us. And I do not believe it's as a result to evolutionary adaptation to fire. More so, it is to other types of disturbance or growing disturbance, such as extreme drought or freeze events. And that these species have the capacity to kind of resprout after uh, uh, abortion of growth, or essentially negative impacts to their growing stems. Okay, forecasting into the future a little bit, what are we predicting with the extent and scope of fires going forward? So this is work by Catherine Jarnovich of the USGS and her team in doing fire modeling. So we used this portion of the Santa Catalina Mountains. So here we're talking in the Catalina State Park area. This is the front range of the Catalinas. Here's the Tucson Valley here, and getting into Saguaro National Park East, or the Rincon Mountains of the Coronado National Forest, with most of this land is. That red line is the Bighorn Fire boundary, the turquoise is the buffalo-grass again, and then that 1,200-meter line, again, that boundary between the grassland and the desert below. So essentially what we did is modeled in this area the both with buffalo grass and expanding buffalo grass populations, and also without buffalo grass, how are fires going, fire simulation models. So the first results were that the area burned with buffalo grass was much greater than without buffalo grass over the next 50-year period. So where this is projecting into the next 50 years. We are also very curious to see what I've been talking about, that wildland urban interface, or that desert scrub area below the grassland. How is that area impacted over the next 50 years? Again, with buffalo grass presence and expansion, or without. And as you would expect, we see a dramatic increase of fires below that 1,200-meter line into the future with buffalo grass. This is looking the same kind of question, but what we're seeing here is in time, the size of the fires that are happening. And so with buffalo grass versus without, there seems to be an inflection point right around 2040, where the scale of those fires increases dramatically, just consistently much larger fires. And that's really because the buffalo grass is infilled and is kind of creating that consistent connectivity link, which is a really frightening scenario, and the implications for both the economics impact of the wildland urban interface, and of course the view sheds and the function of the ecosystems, because you pretty much have turned, in this case, the Catalina foothills into a kind of a frequently reoccurring burning savanna ecosystem, where almost all of your native vegetation has gone out, or very few species. So we believe that while some of these species do have the capacity to regrow after fires, I would say if they're after one or two or more consecutive fires, that many of those would not be able to continue to persist. So, okay, trying to kind of take stock of this, what does this, what are the implications here? What does this mean? How do we address these future scenarios and kind of what's playing out in real time? I think there's a lot of things here. One is that we have to understand that these are mechanisms that are larger than the scale and the scope of, I think, what human society can address directly. And I guess what I mean by that is the spread of buffalo grass and other wild invasive species is happening kind of across the landscape and areas that crosses jurisdictional boundaries, and the different governmental forces can't really keep up with. There are a lot of very valuable efforts being made, and they're making an impact, but we have to be selective and focused of where we're driving that energy and those resources. I think it's also really important to about the awareness of kind of what areas are in jeopardy, and especially kind of the understanding of the, that connection of the high dollar real estate in our communities, and that those areas are in the wildland urban interface and are perhaps directly jeopardized by the increased fire, and the hopefully making that link and having many of the constituents that are live in those areas help kind of advocate for that focus of resources to address these problems. And I would also say that this reality, while it's in the near future, is not immediately here. And I think there's still time for us to understand this change and to try to make some adaptations and changes to help avoid the worst case scenarios. And so that's kind of where I think we can get into in the question and answer period. But there's a lot of things we can do. It goes towards, we know how important voting is and recognizing the economic support that can come from governments, both at many levels, state, federal, local, city, and resources that can go into controlling the impacts of invasive species. And so, for example, if there were $10 million to put towards controlling buffergrass in the Catalina foothills, that's a game changer. It's really about, do we have the logistical capacity to hire that many people to get out there and control the buffergrass on the ground? But in the kind of the spirit of a works program that's being talked about and discussed, I think that, and as we've seen in the history of our country, is entirely possible. For that amount of money, we could put a significant dent into the infestation of buffergrass and creating, not just clearing buffergrass from the area, but actually putting very strategic fire breaks between the grassland and the desert ecosystem that will, again, stop the spread of these fires up and down, and I think preserve a lot of habitat and a lot of very valuable real estate. I think that number is important to keep in context. So $10 million is back of the envelope numbers, but absolutely valid, is to address the buffergrass problem in the Catalina foothills is equal to one, or maybe at most five, the values of 5 homes that are directly imperiled by the buffergrass coming down slope. The amount of evacuations that had to happen in the Catalina foothills due to the Bighorn fire was unprecedented. And many of these people are directly impacted. My family has been evacuated from a fire in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains and before, and it's a horrific experience. And I hope that none of you have or will experience that. But once you are directly touched by these fires, and unfortunately so many of us throughout the West are, the situation becomes visceral, and we understand the dramatic impacts it's making on all of our lives. So I just think that awareness is a really important piece to get at. Also, talking about voting is, how important just kind of different bonds issues come up, and just being aware of opportunities to address these virus concerns. I just think that I'll end on kind of a topic of about just, we all are having to confront rapid change, and the impacts of climate change are happening at scales and paces faster than many of the extreme models predicted. And we're seeing it play out in real time in our backyards. And I think it's just about it's reconciling with that change, what that means at a personal level, what that means at an ecosystem level. And there's a real kind of, I think, adoption of understanding that things will be changing, but change is a constant at the ecosystem level and across. Really, when you think about geologic time, change is absolutely a constant. And even at a more nearest time, the desert we live in is only 13,000 years old. These species came in at the end of the last ice age as temperatures warmed. And there's a reshuffling of species, and fire is playing a dramatic role in that reshuffling. It's a challenging time to live through, but there's a lot that we can learn and a lot to prepare for, and a lot that will come back after the fires pass. And I think we can help actively manage the ways that comes forward too. I would just mention that we were going to be digging into these topics I've been talking to you about and more, especially the climate and the societal response to fires in the West. So we have a series of very kind of similar, maybe I would say a sister series to what you all are producing this month, But this is a one-night webinar, June 2nd, Fire in the Future, Tucson's Big Island Fire 1 year later, with the Arizona Institute for Resilience and the Desert Laboratory in partnership with AZPM. Just type fire in the future or fire on the mountain into Google, and you'll be able to register for that if you want more information. So I hope I left enough time for questions and answers. I'll stop the share, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was a fantastic presentation with lots of really great information. First question that we have with the Q&A is, how do they name wildfires?
So usually I'm not in that business, but from what I've observed, it corresponds to geographic features really close to the point of origin. So in this case, there's a bighorn peak named actually for bighorn sheep that occur in that area of the Push Ridge Wilderness of the Catalina Mountains. And so then the fire was adopted, the bighorn fire. In case of the bushfire, I'm not sure what the feature was, but usually it's right near geographic or other features really close to the point of origin. It's not a linear alphabetical scale like hurricanes.
And I've heard also that the incident commander for the fire dispatch has a little bit of say in that fire name too. The next question is, can fountain grass be banned from being sold?
So yeah, that's a great question, and another really active way that we all can participate in this. So this is a really cool story. So every state has a list of noxious weeds, which are it's a very formal thing led by the governor's office, of which once a species is listed as a noxious weed, then it is not able to be sold at nurseries, and it also is available to be received. Funding is able to be directed to the control of that species using state or other dollars. And so in this case, local Native Plant Society organizations and members of the public, maybe many of you are on such organizations, maybe it played a role in the story I'm telling, have petitioned for fountain grass and buffalo grass, and I think stinknet is now on that direction, and other noxious weeds and species that are driving the changes we're talking about, to be put on that list, and they've been effectively able to do so. And so most fountain grass, I believe, is just been added and is not able to be sold at nurseries. There is a purple variety that has been, I think, fairly solidly been shown to be sterile, and so essentially it doesn't reproduce by its seeds, that I believe may still be allowed to be sold. But I think that linkage between science and then a very active community at the Native Plant Society level or whatever group organization can have really strong ripple effects, and petition for the listing of these species, get them on, and that can have dramatic effects. So that's a great example of a local impact that scales up big time.
Thank you. We had a participant say the bushfire was named after the Bush Highway where the fire started on State Route 87. So I have a question. We don't have any more in the chat right now, but everyone please feel free to add as we're talking. We talked about, you said that natives also, we're seeing that biomass just because of, environmental conditions. So in the future, will we need to look into managing natives as well, possibly?
Well, I mean, I think the way I would say to manage this, and I mentioned it briefly, but maybe I can go in a little detail, is we were walking the perimeter of the Bighorn Fire and just kind of doing this whodunit, or how this happened, what were the dynamics of the fire as it traversed through that desert ecotone, grassland ecotone. We were really struck by how, and again, the fire was moving downslope with fairly low intensity at this point, but how much of an impact either little fire breaks made. So they could either have been from game trails, from deer or bighorn sheep. They could have been put in there, and they were in some cases by the hotshot fire crews. In one case, the hotshot right near the point of ignition of the bighorn fire dropped a line in, and it saved this incredible grove of saguaro, hundreds of saguaros, that was pretty infested by buffalo grass, but they just dropped this line in there, and it was amazing that the fire was burning through and natives and then buffalo grass, and then hit that fire break of a meter maybe and petered out. And so I think that's the angle of management. I think is much more realistic. We don't want to be going and attacking our natives, and I also am really concerned about pre-emergence for any invasive species, because that does get at the native seed bank. Native species are gonna need all the help they can get in getting the chance to establish and not be outcompeted by many of these invasive species. So no, I think it's just understanding that in wet years we're gonna have this increased biomass, and then maybe being a little bit proactive about going out and putting some fire breaks around really high value areas, either they be cultural, ecological, or economic, or or have share those traits.
Thank you. So another question came up in the Q&A. Are herbicides a good treatment for buffalo grass?
It's a really good question. So yes, herbicides are a very effective treatment for buffalo grass and other perennial grass species. They're not very good for annuals because they're going to die in that season anyway, and you're just spraying chemical on the ground. The glyphosate is the active compound that's primarily used and very effective on buffalo grass. It is does not affect succulent species, and it breaks down fairly readily once it hits the ground or the dry ground surface. It is in certain cases of more remote backcountry and steep slopes and large infestations, really the only effective control mechanism. It can be applied with great specificity and expertise and care to avoid native species and to be done in a very safe and controlled environment. There is rightfully so a lot of concern about chemicals and the use of herbicides, but I think it's really important to keep in mind the distinction between the chemicals that are being used by the agro industry on our foods and in growing crop condition versus how we're talking about in this situation in a very deliberate, methodical, careful way away from the human populace and on an invasive species that is in this case definitely the lesser of some great evils.
So this next question actually kind of ties into that one. The question was, is the primary method of management for buffalo grass manual removal?
So that's the other great and one heck of a workout approach to controlling buffalo grass. And it all depends on the location. So in your neighborhood, if you have a patch of buffalo grass, pull that thing by hand after a rain. That's going to be the best way to do it. There's a group here in Tucson called the Tucson Weed Whackers that have been focusing on the Tucson Mountains or the west side of Tucson for goodness, about 25 years now. And they only do hand pulling. I think they go out once a month during that period, the volunteer efforts. And the amount of buffalo grass they have removed and the amount of acres that they have maintained as buffalo grass free is remarkable. I mean, it's the majority of the Tucson Mountains. It's an incredible success story. And again, shows how these local grassroots efforts, literally grassroots in this case, are able to sustain and have ripple effects that are both societally impactful, but also at the landscape level have huge impact. So I am a huge advocate for hand pulling of buffalo grass, especially in areas where it makes a lot of sense. But in many areas that are so inaccessible, so large, the scale really has to be addressed by chemical approaches.
And I think that's a really poignant example of, like you said, just, efforts, our work that we can do. And a lot of times it feels really hopeless. You stand there and see a huge stand of red brome and feel really overwhelmed, but you really can make an impact, especially with, getting groups together and getting out there. So the next question we have, so plants that are re-sprouting, we saw a lot of that in the graph that you presented. Do you think this is, kind of their last ditch effort to kind of throw out what they have left? And what will that, which I know you said you're going to monitor that over the next few years, but what do you think about that? And then can you address the recovery of invasives versus natives post fire?
Yeah, awesome questions. This drought sure doesn't help things for this resprouting species affected by the fire. It's I would say in a conditions when non-drought conditions, I don't think it's necessarily their last gasp efforts. I think there's a pretty expensive root network that is supporting that regrowth, and the fact that they were regrowing without rain tells me that they're pretty robust. So I don't think they can sustain repeated fires, but I do think that in decent rain years they are probably pretty robust. This year, a lot depends on the next coming months here and how favorable the monsoon is for good rain. In terms of competition with invasive species, yeah, that's a critical one, and there's our knowledge of succession or kind of reestablishment of native versus non-native species in a burned desert environment is really low. There are very few studies that look at that because up to now there have been relatively few occurrences of that, and so we're at the hypothesis stage and taking the data to test that. Some species we know do fairly well in invasive species areas. They're very few and far between. Brittlebush is one of them, Encina farinosa. I'm curious if the fairy duster or the Janusia that had such high percentage of resprouting, if they may be others that do well. So I think it's not just this data set, there are others, people in other areas tracking similar changes. And I'm not aware, but I imagine there are similar studies being done in the Tonto National Forest and the bushfire footprint.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we have. Ben, thank you again so much for all of the information, for being with us tonight. And we're looking forward to seeing what we learn from here forward. And thank you all for being here tonight. We appreciate you attending. This will be on Casca's YouTube channel in the coming days. And also we have our Wildfire Awareness campaign with Casca and the Metro Phoenix Ecoflora that will continue through the end of the month. Check us out on social media and also our blog posts, which you can find those links through our social and websites. And also we encourage you to join Desert Defenders here in the Metro Phoenix area, which maps invasive species and works on removal projects in our parks and preserves. And that's all we have for tonight. Everyone have a great evening.